She saved the Alpha Prince from drowning. Years later, he hunted the silent Luna, who remembered the lake. The bowl of moonwater trembled in Liora Fen's hands before she even understood why. Lady Seraphina Dorn stood at the center of the great hall, bathed in silver light. Her voice rising through the final notes of a song every soul in Vale Kingdom had been waiting years to hear. It was the lake song. The one the lost prince remembered from the night he almost drowned. Alpha King Adrian Vale stood before the blood moon basin, one hand resting on its carved edge. His face caught somewhere between hope and a grief he had carried since childhood. The great hall had been dressed for triumph. Banners of Vale Kingdom hung between every pillar, and every noble house that mattered had traveled through the night to witness a savior finally claimed after years of searching. Liora watched from the shadow of the pillars, where silent servants were meant to stand, invisible, useful, unheard. She had polished that basin 100 times. She had never once been asked to speak near it, because everyone in that palace had long ago decided she had nothing worth hearing. As Seraphina reached the final note, pain tore through Leora's throat, sudden and burning, like swallowing broken glass. She gasped without sound, the way she always did, and the bowl slipped from her fingers. Moonwater spread across the stone floor in a widening silver sheet. The drowned moon lake, far beyond the palace walls, answered with a sound like the earth itself groaning. The water on the floor began to move against its own nature, gathering, rising, tracing letters no living hand had written. The court gasped. Adrian turned. The moonwater had formed 3 words, glowing faintly silver in the torchlight. The singer lied. Seraphina's face went the color of bone. Adrian looked past her, past the crowd, past the golden ceremony built to crown a savior, and found the only person in that hall who had never once tried to convince him of anything. A silent servant girl, kneeling in spilled water, blood beginning to bead faintly silver at the corner of her lips. He did not yet know her name, but something in his chest, old and buried, had already begun to remember. Years earlier, when Adrian was 12, he had fled the palace after a royal trial that ended with his father's voice raised in disappointment loud enough to follow him down every corridor. He ran until the trees swallowed the torchlight, until he reached the old stone bridge above the drowned moon lake, forbidden ground after moonrise, cursed ground, the kind of place nurses warned children about instead of monsters. His foot slipped on wet stone. The water took him before he could call for help. It was colder than anything he had ever felt, silver and endless, pressing into his lungs, pulling his wolf down with him into a darkness that did not care he was a prince. Then he heard singing, small, unsteady, closer than it should have been. A girl no older than he was swam down through that black water, grabbed his collar with both hands, and hauled him toward the surface with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own small body. She kept singing the whole way up, a thin thread of sound wrapped around his fading wolf like a rope. On the shore, she pressed her small hands to his chest and did not stop until his breathing steadied. He remembered a grass bracelet on her wrist, damp and green. He remembered her eyes, wide and frightened, fixed on his face rather than on the guards, now shouting through the trees. He did not remember her voice breaking. He was already being carried away by then, wrapped in a guard's cloak, fevered and shivering, and by the time anyone thought to ask who had pulled the prince from the lake, the girl was gone. What no one in the palace ever learned was what happened after. The old prophecy bound to the drowned moon lake said the Alpha Prince was meant to die there, his death sealing an ancient wolf spirit beneath the water. When the girl saved him, that seal cracked. The lake did not forgive an unpaid debt easily. It reached into her chest that same night and pulled her voice out like a thread from old cloth, leaving her gasping on the shore beside the boy she had just saved, unable to make a single sound. Her name was Liora Fen. She walked home alone that night, soaked and shaking, and told her mother nothing, because she had nothing left to tell it with. The village called her Lake Mute after that, and worse, when kindness ran out. An old healer once looked at her ruined throat and murmured that the lake must have taken her voice as punishment for trespassing, and no one thought to ask what she might have been doing out there in the first place. There had been a time, in the first months after the lake took her voice, when Liora still tried to explain herself, pointing at her own throat, miming the shape of swimming, drawing crude pictures of a boy in the mud with a stick. No one had the patience to translate a frightened child's silence into a truth large enough to involve the crown. Eventually, she stopped trying, not because she had given up on being believed, but because trying and failing had begun to hurt more than the silence itself. Liora carried the truth of that night alone for years, growing into a silent servant in the palace's lake wing, tending the very shrine built to honor a rescue no one believed she had performed. She learned to live inside silence the way other people learn to live inside language. She wrote short, sharp truths in chalk when words needed to be blunt. She tied memory into small knots of cord, one knot for every promise she needed to remember keeping. And when nothing else could reach through a moment, she tapped rhythms against stone or wood or skin, the oldest language she had, older even than the voice the lake had taken from her. She kept the true grass bracelet from that night hidden in a small cloth pouch beneath her sleeve, because Lady Seraphina Dorn had begun wearing an identical 1 month ago, claiming it as proof of her own heroism. Liora's wound was simple and it never fully closed. The lake did not only take my voice, she often wrote on the wall behind her cot, in careful chalk letters meant for no one but herself. It took the only proof a poor girl was allowed to have. Adrian Vale grew into his crown, believing that somewhere in his kingdom lived the girl who had saved his life, and that if he simply searched long enough, hard enough, he would find her. He remembered fragments. Cold water, a broken thread of song, a grass bracelet against pale skin. He did not remember that the voice singing to him might have been silenced by the very act of saving him, because no one had ever told him that cost existed. He searched for a singer, because a singer was something a court could recognize, applaud, and crown. He never once considered that the girl who saved him might have gone the rest of her life unable to sing anything at all. When Lady Seraphina Dorn arrived at court with the exact melody from that night trembling on her lips, and a grass bracelet identical to the one seared into his memory, Adrian let himself believe the search was finally over. He wanted it to be over. Grief has a way of making the first convincing answer look like truth. What he did not know was that House Dorn had spent years quietly acquiring pieces of the old lake archive, buying silence from clerks, bribing forgotten record keepers, and building Seraphina's performance detail by detail until it was nearly seamless. Seraphina had been raised for this moment since she was old enough to hold a note, drilled in the melody by tutors who never told her why it mattered, coached in the precise tilt of her chin when she spoke of childhood heroism she had never lived. Her mother used to tell her that a Luna's greatest gift was not courage, but certainty, the ability to stand in a room and make an entire kingdom believe whatever she needed them to believe. Seraphina had learned that lesson well. She did not think of what she was doing as theft. She thought of it as inheritance, a role she had been groomed to fill long before she understood there was a real girl somewhere who had actually paid for it. Seraphina herself did not think of it as a lie so much as a correction. She had been raised from childhood on the belief that a kingdom needed a Luna who could stand in front of a crowd and be believed. Not a girl who could only tap out truths no one had patience to learn. A truth no one can hear is not a truth, she told herself often, the way people repeat comforting lies until they start to feel like philosophy. It is only a burden. When she looked at Liora across the hall that night, after the moonwater had spoken its accusation, she did not see guilt reflected back at her. She saw an obstacle. "You saved him once, perhaps," she said quietly, stepping close enough that only Liora could hear her over the murmuring court. "But I am the one who can stand beside him where everyone can hear." Leora's throat throbbed with fresh pain, silver blood cooling at the corner of her mouth. And she said nothing, because saying nothing was the only weapon the lake had left her. In the days that followed, Seraphina moved quickly to contain the damage. She had Leora's knot cords quietly confiscated from the lake wing, calling them unsanitary clutter unfit for a royal shrine. She arranged for chalk messages Liora left near the healer's hall to be washed away before anyone official could read them. And she began, carefully, to plant the idea among the court that the silent maid had always been strange, unstable, prone to lake-touch delusions that made her imagine herself important. It might have worked completely, if not for Rowan Pike. Rowan had been a stable boy the night Adrian nearly drowned, sent to fetch water near the old bridge, close enough to see a small girl dive into the black lake and drag the prince to shore with her own hands. He had grown into a palace guard since then, quiet and steady, the kind of man who did his duty and rarely spoke unless spoken to. He recognized Liora the moment he was assigned to the lake wing years later, though he never told her so directly, not until the night the moonwater spoke. "I saw you," he said simply, finding her alone by the shrine after the ceremony. "That night. I was young, but I saw you pull him out." Leora's hands shook as she reached for her chalk. She wrote quickly, pressing hard enough to crack the stick. "You cannot say that." "Not yet." Rowan frowned. "Why not? It's the truth." "If they know you saw," she wrote, "they will take it from you the way the lake took it from me." She was afraid, and her fear made a kind of sense that felt like wisdom at the time. She believed that if Rowan's testimony stayed hidden, Seraphina and Elder Caldrus would have no reason to touch him. No reason to bury his memory the way her own had been buried by silence and circumstance. So she asked him to say nothing, and out of respect for her, he agreed. It was the wrong choice, though neither of them understood that yet. Seraphina found out about Rowan within the week, the way she found out about most things that threatened her position. Threw coin passed quietly into the right hands. She did not wait for him to speak. She accused him first. Before the full council, she claimed Rowan had been paid by the silent maid to fabricate a story that would discredit the kingdom's true savior, presenting a forged ledger entry as proof of the bribe. Rowan was stripped of his post within the hour, his protests dismissed, as the desperate excuses of a man caught in a lie. Elder Caldrus, keeper of the old lake records, summoned him privately that same night. "Sign this," Caldrus said, sliding a single page across the table. The words "memory denial" written along its header in formal court script. "Admit your account of that night was mistaken. It will go easier for you." "It wasn't mistaken," Rowan said. "I know what I saw." Caldrus's expression did not change. "A kingdom cannot afford every truth the past tries to return," he said quietly. When Rowan refused to sign, Caldrus did not argue further. He simply invoked an old lake ritual. one meant to soothe grief-stricken minds after tragedy, and used it instead to blur the edges of Rowan's memory until the young man could no longer say with certainty what he had seen at all. Caldrus then sealed the relevant page of the lake archive himself, removing any trace of a stable boy's witness account from the official record. When Liora learned what had happened, the guilt hit her harder than the pain in her throat ever had. She found Rowan near the old stables, his eyes distant in a way that frightened her more than his anger would have. "You tried to save my memory by hiding my mouth," he said slowly, as though reaching for words through fog. "But a witness no one hears is just another thing drowned." Liora had no answer written that could undo what her fear had cost him. She understood finally, sitting there in the cold, stable air, that silence chosen to protect someone was not the same as safety, and that hiding a truth for love could still leave it just as buried as hiding it for shame. Adrian, meanwhile, could not stop thinking about the words written in spilled moonwater. He requested the full Savior search records from the archive, expecting confirmation of everything Seraphina had claimed. What he found instead troubled him. There were song transcriptions, noble witness statements, bracelet replicas commissioned by 3 different houses hoping to claim the rescue for themselves over the years, healer notes about his own fever following the incident, detailed down to the hour. But there was nothing about any village girl who lost her voice that same night. Nothing about servants treated for shock near the lake. Nothing about a stable boy removed from the witness rolls, though Adrian now vaguely recalled a name once mentioned, and then quietly dropped from every subsequent report. His court had recorded every fever dream of the prince who survived. It had not recorded the girl who could no longer speak after saving him. He sat alone in the archive long after the last clerk had gone home, turning page after page under a single candle, searching for even one line that mentioned a girl who had lost something the night he was found alive. He found receipts for the healers who tended his fever. He found letters of gratitude sent to noble families who had offered comfort during his recovery. He did not find a single record of thanks sent toward anyone poor, anyone unnamed, anyone who might have actually been in that water with him. The realization sat heavy in his chest as he closed the archive that night, and for the first time since Seraphina's song had filled the great hall, doubt took root where certainty had been. He began watching Liora differently after that, not as a curiosity, as a question he had been too afraid to ask. Elder Caldrus, sensing the shift in his king, tried to close the matter before it could spread further. He requested a private audience and laid out the prophecy in full, the ancient binding that required the Alpha Prince to die in the lake, to seal an old wolf spirit beneath its waters. "When the girl saved you," Caldrus said carefully, the seal cracked. "If your people learn their king's survival came at the cost of an unfinished sacrifice, it will destabilize everything we have built since. Better the truth stays where it fell. Even if it fell on an innocent girl," Adrian said. Caldrus did not flinch. "A drowned truth is still safer than a living panic." Adrian left that meeting with his suspicion confirmed in the worst possible way. Caldrus was not lying to protect Seraphina. He was lying to protect the illusion of a kingdom that had never had to face what its own survival cost someone else. Seraphina, growing desperate as the court's certainty wavered, approached Liora directly with an offer meant to look like mercy. "You could be moved to the quiet shrine," she said, "cared for, called a blessed lake witness even. All I would need from you is a handprint on a single page, admitting your vision of that night was mistaken. Your silence can become holy," she added, almost gently, "if you stop making it inconvenient. For one terrible moment, Liora considered it. A dark mark had begun creeping up her throat whenever she resisted the lake's old current, and the offer promised an end to that pain, an end to the danger hanging over Rowan and her mother both. Then Adrian's voice cut through the shrine's quiet. He had been standing in the doorway longer than either of them realized. A shrine that asks you to bury your truth, he said, is only a prettier shore. Liora looked at him and, for the first time, let herself believe that someone in that palace might actually be looking for the truth instead of a convenient ending to it. She began building what she came to think of as the drowned truth chain, gathering every fragment strong enough to hold together what her voice alone could not prove. She started with Rowan, writing out in careful chalk exactly how she had asked him to stay silent, and why and how wrong that choice had been. He did not forgive her instantly, but he agreed to stand as witness again, this time in the open, protected rather than hidden. Old healer Sava came next, producing a decades-old note describing a young girl's throat, burned and silver-flecked, treated quietly the very night the prince was pulled from the lake, and never mentioned again once the family paid for her silence. Liora's own mother, Liora Fen, finally learned the truth her daughter had carried alone for years, and though the grief of it staggered her, she stood ready to speak of the voiceless child who came home that night soaked to the bone. Piece by piece the chain grew, each link a person who had once been asked, in one way or another, to stay quiet for someone else's comfort. Liora kept every testimony tied together with careful knots, one cord for each witness, laid out across the shrine floor like a map of every silence the palace had ever demanded. She no longer hid the cords from view. Where Seraphina had once ordered them confiscated as clutter, Adrian now had guards posted to protect them, a small, deliberate reversal that told the whole lake wing something had fundamentally shifted. A memory carried by one silent girl could be called madness, Liora wrote one night, staring at the growing collection of testimonies before her. A memory carried by witnesses became a shore the lie could not wash away. The final piece came not from a person, but from the lake itself. When Adrian brought Liora to the old archive to compare Seraphina's transcribed song against the original lake records Caldrus had tried to bury, they found something the stolen copy had missed entirely. The written melody was accurate, note for note, but it was missing something the parchment could never capture. A pause. 3 full beats of silence near the song's end. The exact moment Liora's lungs had filled with water, and her voice had briefly failed before she forced the last notes out. Seraphina had learned the song. She had never learned the silence inside it. Adrian closed his eyes, and something in his chest, wolf and man together, recognized that pause the way a heartbeat recognizes its own rhythm. The court remembered the song. His wolf remembered the silence inside it. Word of the discovery reached Seraphina before the council could formally reconvene, and rather than retreat, she pushed forward, moving to complete the Savior Luna ceremony before anyone could stop her. If it succeeded, the stolen rescue would become permanent royal record. Liora's voice would remain lost to the lake forever, with no legal claim left to reclaim it. Rowan's restored testimony would be overwritten. Caldrus would be free to seal the archive for good. Caldrus worked quickly behind the scenes, calling in favors from every noble house that owed House Dorn political debts, rushing the ceremony forward before doubt could fully take root among the council. He told himself he was protecting the kingdom's stability. In truth, he was protecting himself from having to admit how much damage his own silence had already done. The great hall filled again within days, faster than any ceremony in living memory. nobles kneeling as Seraphina approached the blood moon basin in a gown the exact silver of moonlit water. Adrian stood at the basin's edge, his hand hovering above the ancient stone, caught between the momentum of a kingdom eager for resolution and the doubt now lodged permanently in his chest. The savior seal around Seraphina's wrists began to glow. The lake water in the ceremonial bowls darkened, thickening like ink. Liora felt her remaining memories of that night begin to blur at the edges, threatened by the sheer force of a stolen song, sung with royal permission. Adrian turned to her, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. "What do you choose?" Her hand trembled as she raised her chalk. "I choose the truth before my voice." It meant, and he understood exactly what it meant, that she was willing to let the lake keep her voice forever if the truth could finally surface in its place. Seraphina's song rose to its final verse, the court around her kneeling deeper, moved by melody they mistook entirely for proof. Caldrus moved toward the archive doors, prepared to seal them the moment the ceremony concluded, prepared to bury every loose thread the drowned truth chain had gathered. Liora walked past the kneeling nobles to the edge of the basin. The lake water churned violently now, black and silver twisting together, and for a moment it felt as though the whole room might drown in it. Rowan stepped forward as witness, refusing to be silent this time. Old healer Sava held up her decades-old record for the court to see. Liora Fen's voice broke as she described her daughter coming home unable to speak. The very same night, the prince was carried back to the palace, fevered and alive. Caldras's hidden prophecy page was placed on the basin's edge by Adrian's own hand. His wolf pressed against his ribs, straining toward something only it seemed to understand. Liora did not try to sing. She could not. Instead, she pressed her fingers to the stone rim of the basin and began to tap. 1 beat. 2 beats. 3 silent beats, exactly as they had happened years ago in the cold black water. The pause where her voice had failed before she forced herself to keep him alive anyway. The lake water surged upward at the rhythm, rising into a column of silver light that filled the hall, and within it, faint and trembling, the court saw a small girl dragging a drowning boy toward the surface, her mouth open in a song the water itself seemed to remember better than any transcription ever could. Seraphina sang louder, desperate now, trying to drown the vision beneath her own voice. The lake did not answer her. It had stopped answering songs the moment it recognized the rhythm underneath one. For one breath, Liora could not tell whether the water filling her lungs belonged to the lake, to the night she saved him, or to every truth she had swallowed because no one believed a silent girl. "Silence cannot be crowned," Seraphina shouted over the rising water, her composure finally cracking. Liora reached into the churning basin and, with what strength the lake allowed her, wrote across its surface in trembling silver script, "Then let the lake crown the truth you stole." The fake grass bracelet on Seraphina's wrist dissolved instantly, unraveling into strands of ordinary grass that sank beneath the water. In Liora's other hand, hidden until that exact moment, the true bracelet began to glow, faint green light pulsing in time with her tapped rhythm. Adrian stepped back from the screens entirely, refusing the seal now blooming toward him, refusing the ceremony that would have made a stolen story permanent. "I spent years searching for the girl who could tell me she saved me," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned hall. "I never asked whether saving me was the reason she could not speak." The savior seal shattered. Seraphina's song died in her throat, unfinished, and the court that had been kneeling for her rose slowly, uncertainly, turning instead toward the silent girl standing at the edge of the basin, soaked and shaking, and, for the first time in her life, believed. Caldrus tried one final time to reach the archive doors, moving to seal them before the truth could be formally recorded. He was too late. The silent rhythm had already opened what his ritual had spent years trying to keep closed, and guards loyal to the crown stopped him before he crossed the threshold. In the days that followed, Adrian did not simply announce that Seraphina had lied. He stood before the full council and named his own failure plainly. "I searched for a song," he said, "because it was easier than searching for what my survival had cost." He dissolved the Savior Luna ceremony entirely, striking it from royal law. He restored Rowan Pike to his post, with formal acknowledgement of the injustice done to him. He ordered the lake archive fully reopened, its records available to any witness regardless of birth or station. He named Liora, publicly and without qualification, as the true savior of the drowned prince, though he was careful, deliberately careful, not to attach that title to any claim on her hand or her future. He removed Elder Caldrus from his position as keeper of the lake records, though he stopped short of exile, choosing instead to have him oversee the very witness reviews his cover-up had once prevented. Locking the truth away again would only prove I learned nothing, Adrian told the council when questioned about the leniency. Before the assembled court, he turned to Liora and asked the only question that mattered now. "Do you want your voice returned, if the lake allows it?" She did not answer immediately. It was, Adrian realized as he watched her consider it, the first time in her life anyone had made that choice hers to make, instead of theirs to decide for her. In the weeks that followed, the council drafted what became known as the Voice of the Lake Covenant, a document stripped of unnecessary ceremony and built instead around 5 plain principles the kingdom could not be allowed to forget again. No savior claim could be accepted without full witness review. No silent testimony could be dismissed simply because it lacked spoken voice. No memory archive could exclude servants, villagers, or the poor who witnessed events nobles preferred forgotten. No stolen song or symbolic relic could override the recognition of a soul-wolf bond. No savior could be pressed into becoming Luna without separate, freely given consent. Its strongest line, the one carved above the archive's newly reopened doors, read simply, "No truth shall be drowned because the person who carries it cannot speak." Liora was named Keeper of Drowned Truths, a role created specifically for her, not because she had saved a prince, and not because a king wished to claim her, but because a kingdom finally understood it needed someone to guard the stories that could not defend themselves. Adrian found her by the lakeshore some time later, away from court, away from ceremony, away from anyone who might turn the moment into another performance. He held out the true grass bracelet, restored and dried, and offered it back to her rather than keeping it as a royal relic. "What do you want me to do with the memory?" he asked quietly. She took her chalk and wrote against the stone beside her, "Remember it without owning me." He looked at the words for a long moment, then nodded, something easing in his shoulders that had been tense since the night the moonwater first spoke. "Then I will remember," he said. He did not ask her to stay by his side that evening, and he did not ask when, or if, she might one day stand beside him as more than a keeper of drowned truths. He simply sat a small distance away, close enough for company, far enough to leave the choice entirely hers and let the quiet stretch between them without trying to fill it. Liora found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind the quiet at all anymore. For most of her life, silence had felt like something taken from her. Sitting there beside him, it finally felt like something she had chosen to keep. She looked out at the lake, calmer now than she had ever seen it, and understood that for the first time in years, she did not need to prove anything to the water in front of her. A month passed before the change came. The drowned moon lake was no longer sealed after moonrise, and a small wooden pier had been built along its edge, a place where memories once thought drowned could finally be spoken aloud, or written, or tapped out for anyone patient enough to listen. Rowan stood watch there now, not as a jailer guarding forbidden water, but as a witness honoring what the lake had once tried to hide. He and Liora spoke rarely of the night his memory had been taken, but the silence between them now felt different, chosen rather than imposed, the quiet of two people who had already said the hardest things and did not need to repeat them. Sometimes, in the evenings, he taught village children to skip stones along the new pier, telling them, when they asked, that the lake was not something to fear anymore, only something to remember carefully. Liora Fen visited often. Finally able to hear the whole truth of the night, her daughter came home, voiceless and afraid. Seraphina's song was struck from the royal record entirely, and House Dorne's standing at court diminished with it. Though Adrian, true to the covenant he had signed, ensured she faced consequence through law rather than cruelty. Caldrus worked in the reopened archive under careful watch, cataloging the very testimonies he had once tried to erase, a slow penance neither forgiven nor forgotten. One evening, Liora stood alone at the water's edge as the lake shimmered silver beneath a rising moon. It offered her voice back the way it always could, without pressure, without demand. She lifted her hand to her throat and tried, the way she had tried 100 times before and failed. This time, a small sound broke free, rough and unpracticed, nothing like a song. One word, enough. Adrian stood a respectful distance behind her, close enough to witness, careful not to touch her, careful not to turn this moment into another claim. A child from the palace kitchens, too young to understand the weight of what she was asking, tugged at Liora's sleeve and looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Can silence tell the truth?" Liora knelt down, her voice still hoarse, still new, still entirely her own. "Yes," she said, "but only if someone stops calling silence empty." The child nodded solemnly and ran off toward the pier, already more interested in skipping stones than in the weight of the answer she had been given. Liora rose and looked out across the water one last time before turning toward the palace lights in the distance. The lake had taken her voice for saving a prince. The court had taken her story because she could not speak it. But under Liora's watch, Thorn Kingdom learned that truth did not always arrive as a song. Sometimes it arrived as 3 silent beats between breaths, and the wolf who had once been drowning finally remembered who had taught him how to breathe.